Thank you, Amada, and welcome everybody. As Amada mentioned, on behalf of BJA, CNA's Center for Justice Research and Innovation, and the Arizona State University Center for Problem-Oriented Policing, I wanted to welcome you to the publication release event for the Problem-Oriented Policing Guide titled Gunshot Detection, Reducing Gunfire Through Acoustic Technology. My name is Chris Sun, and I am the co-director of the SPI TTA team. And today we'll be discussing contemporary research and evidence-based practice regarding gunshot detection systems. As a little bit of background on the POP Guide series, we've been partnering with the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing for, I think it's between 6 and 7 years now, on evidence-based practical guides for a number of topics. SPI and the POP Center have partnered on topics such as retaliatory violence, focused deterrence, hotspots policing, and this will be the fourth iteration of a POP guide that is co-branded with SPI and the POP Center. As a little bit of an overview of today's agenda, we will hear from Dr. Dennis Maris about everything included in the POP guide, from technical capabilities of gunshot detection systems to how agencies can think about using this tool to address crime in your communities. And we will also hear from an SPI site, the Winston-Salem, North Carolina Police Department, that is actively implementing many of the ideas presented in the guide in their gunshot detection deployment. As a brief introduction on the guide in today's webinar, agencies across the country have been implementing gunshot detection systems for the last 10 plus years. SPI has a long history of supporting agencies and evaluating these systems dating back to the East Palo Alto, California SPI site in 2012, with more recent SPI sites including Memphis, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, and Wilmington, Delaware. However, a robust evidence base on how agencies can effectively integrate these technologies to address crime has only really been unfolding over the last 3 to 5 years, and really over the last 1 or 2, with contributions from many of these SPI sites. So when Dr. Maris, author of the POP Guide and longtime research partner with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, pitched the idea to develop a comprehensive guide to gunshot detection effectiveness and how agencies need to consider operational responses to activations, BJA and our team felt it was an ideal time to put this resource together for the law enforcement community. This guide is the culmination of what is currently known about gunshot detection systems and designed to help agencies think through not only when considering installation of these systems, but also how to utilize them most effectively once they are installed. So with that, I will start with introductions. Know that the POP Guide and all the POP Guides that SPI has available are available on the SPI website. I'm now going to introduce both of our speakers today. Dr. Dennis Maris is a professor of criminal justice at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and the inaugural director of the Center for Crime Science and Violence Prevention in Belleville, Illinois. Dennis is also the research partner on multiple law enforcement technology grant projects supported by BJA and is a subject matter expert for CNA's SPI TTA team, including supporting the Winston-Salem SPI site. Captain Amy Gauldin is a 23-year veteran of the Winston-Salem Police Department and a graduate of the FBI National Academy. Captain Gauldin currently serves as the Criminal Investigations Division Commander and previously served as the project manager for the Crime Gun Intelligence Center Grant and Smart Policing Initiative Grant. These two projects focus on implementation of gunshot detection and the development of real-time crime center to drive agencies' intelligence-led policing efforts. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dennis to kick us off with the rest of the webinar. Dennis?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that great introduction. And thank you for CNA and BJA for hosting the webinar. So let me start a little bit about talking about what gunshot detection is and how it works. And I'm sure that some of you already know this, but let me go over it real briefly for those that don't. So how does gunshot detection work? It works by detecting sound waves of a muzzle blast when a gun is fired. Usually that happens through multiple sensors that are in different locations, and Each of those locations will receive the sound of that gun blast at a slightly different time because the sound of speed is constant, but the distance from the muzzle blast is not. And so together, those sensors then work and figure out exactly where the gunshot originates from. Once that happens, a sound that's picked up by these sensors, and that can be gunshots, it can also be other sounds, they're then ran through software filters that basically figure out if this is a gunshot or if it's something else. And in some cases, too, gunshot detection systems have an additional layer of review that's done by regular folks in a review center that look over the alerts that come in and determine even more confidently whether those are actual gunshots or something else. So how accurate are these gunshot location systems? What we know from independent studies that were done, and most of these were done quite some time ago, to be frank, so I think the number is a bit of an underestimate of how accurate it is today. But in those initial tests, we found that gunshot detection is about 80 to 90% accurate in positively detecting actual gunfire in a live test. I think right now the numbers are probably a little bit higher, but I haven't seen any recent studies come out in that specific area. What is a little bit less clear is what the total percentage of false positives are. And false positives are when a gunshot detection system that thinks it detects a gunshot, but is actually something else, like a nail gun, a car backfiring, and something of that nature that sounds a lot like gunfire, but isn't. My best sense of it is that the false positivity rate is usually not that super high. You're talking about a couple percent typically. Now, what can impact the accuracy of a gunshot detection system, though? There's a couple of things that can influence the accuracy of both the detection as well as the exact location. So, for instance, if you have a lot of tall buildings, they create echo, and that can sometimes lead to a misidentification of the exact location. You can also think about if you fire a gun under dense tree coverage, that's going to muffle the sound some. And so if you have sensors that are relatively far away, they may not be as quick to pick those things up. Same thing with weather. Snow and rainfall and wind can all interfere with accurate detection. And at the same time, you have some ambient noise that always takes place in an urban environment. And so that can also impact the accuracy. But on the whole, I would say that gunshot detection is a relatively accurate technology that most of the time will give you an indication if an actual gunshot happened or not. You move to the next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. So what are some of the known benefits of gunshot detection? I think the primary benefit that we're seeing in these systems is that it enhances the overall response to gunfire in your community. The reality is that most gunfire is not reported by your community residents. And so you're missing out on a lot of, gunfire that you're not responding to typically. And that's, I think, problematic. So a gunshot detection system can sort of create that gap a little bit between what is reported and what is not. What we also know from several studies is that, having a gunshot detection system does speed up the response to a gunfire. So it usually means that you have a statistically significant improved response speed. Now that's good because the faster you get there, the higher the chances are that you are able to find somebody that actually fired a gun, or that you can render aid to a victim of a gunshot. One important benefit too of gunshot detection is that it improves the general spatial accuracy of the response. It gives you basically a dot on a map to respond to. That is very different from calls you get from the community. In many cases, people don't actually see who's firing a gun and just report to you that, there's some gunshots I heard, and then good luck figuring out where that happens. So your officers are driving around for, a long period of time and may not end up finding anything. With a gunshot detection system, you generally have a much more accurate sense of where it happened, and can more quickly find the actual location and find shell casings or a victim or whatnot. What we see too in several of the studies is that once you implement a gunshot detection system, you will see a reduction in the calls for service for gunshots from the public. Now, is that a benefit or not? I'm not always 100% sure whether it is. because in some cases, I think that dropping calls from the community may simply be a reflection that the gunshot detection system preempts those calls. Because sometimes people wait a few minutes to call the police, but if you get in there much quicker now, you get there in that time frame where people were waiting to call or not. And so whether that's actually a benefit or not is something that's, I think, still a little bit up for debate. Another huge benefit, though, of the gunshot detection systems is that it improves significantly your evidence recovery, particularly of shell casings and projectiles. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why is gunshot detection better than relying strictly on residential calls for gunfire? I'm not saying that, when you have a gunshot detection in place, you shouldn't, be relying on residents anymore, because they do add a lot of value to, the identification of people that fired a gun or potential victims. But when you're thinking about gunshot detection, one, you're going to get a lot more volume of gunfire. And so you'll be able to respond there quicker, of course, as I just mentioned. Typically, only about 10 to 20% of gunfire in a community is reported by residents. Now, that doesn't mean that the residents are unwilling to report that in many cases. In some cases, sure, there may be trust issues with the police community as well that have an influence on this. But when we look at when gunshots typically happen, and most of the gunfire that happens typically occurs between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. in the morning, residents will be asleep, and it's far more difficult to hear the gunfire. But also, once you're in bed, getting up to call the police and report it is a much higher threshold than if you're awake. Gunfire also tends to happen a lot more during the warmer times of the year, particularly in the summer. And a lot of communities, residents will have their air conditioners running. And if you look at where typically these systems are implemented, they tend to be implemented a lot of times in older communities where central HVAC doesn't exist, but where you have a window unit. If you're asleep in a room with a window unit running, it's again going to be much harder to hear that gunfire. So I don't think it's an issue of people being unwilling to report gunfire in general, but I think the gunshot detection system sort of circumvents a lot of the situations where it's much more difficult for community residents to report. It's also the case that, people tend to call in when they hear a lot of rounds being fired, but may not necessarily pick up on 1 or 2 rounds fired. They may dismiss it as something that it wasn't a gunshot or something else. And so with gunshot detection systems, you'll get a lot more of those report with a few rounds fired, and you'll have knowledge about that. Next slide, please. So what are some of the other potential benefits that we're seeing and may see? And again, these are some of the things that we're not quite as sure about because the research is a little bit mixed. So some of the studies have indeed found that a gunshot detection system can reduce gun violence in your community, but not all sites do. And in my own personal experience working with both St. Louis and Cincinnati and evaluating the systems, one of the things I found is that for a system to be successful in reducing gun violence, it appears that a lot of it is related to how well you implement the system, how well you respond, how well you investigate the gunfire alerts. What is also becoming a little bit clearer in the research is that we're finding that when you have a gunshot detection system, you are able to get there quicker, render aid to victims quicker, and get them to the hospital quicker. And that generally improves the medical outcomes of shooting incidents, of course. Another thing that isn't used very often by agencies, and it's really kind of an underutilized area, I think, is that the data generated by gunshot detection systems is very useful to assessing hotspots for gunfire. This is much more difficult with gun violence data by itself because you have far fewer data points. But with a gunshot detection system, you have more data points and you are able to generate, I think, more reliable and quicker, if there are changes in your hotspots in your community. I think also, and this is something, again, that I think is not always being done equally well by agencies that implement it, is that you can use the response to a gunfire incident as an opportunity to interact with your community. Because you have an accurate location, you can knock on doors of surrounding residences and talk to these community members and say, hey, we're investigating this gunfire. Um, and I think that sends a message that one, you care about, gunfire incidents and improving the quality of life for community residents. And I think that's an important thing that's we have to do to show the community that we care, but also that we're really not accepting this kind of behavior in our communities. Next slide, please. Are there drawbacks as well? Yeah, I think there are some drawbacks. Some people have complained about gunshot detection system as another layer in which police agencies over police communities of color. And I hear that comment, but I think also you have to contextualize that with these are the communities that are suffering from gun violence the most, and those are the ones that stand to benefit the most if this works well. So I don't think it's right to say that we're targeting communities of color with this. I think it's a good indicator that your police department in your city are willing to step up and make sure that those communities become safer. Another potential drawback, though, and this is something that can happen, is that if you get a lot of false positives in your system, so let's say your system is triggering a lot of alerts of construction sites, for instance, and you send your officers out there and they basically go for nothing. If that happens a lot in your system, what ends up happening in some cases is that your officers become soured on the system and are less likely to thoroughly investigate these incidents. So if there's a situation where you do hear from officers that there's a lot of false positives, I think it's important to reach out to your vendor and discuss this issue with them and seeing if there's a resolution to it and to improve the accuracy of the system. Don't wait it out, because if you do that, I think ultimately you may lose some of your officers' buy-in on the system. Another thing, too, is that when residents do call police for shootings and for gunfire, those tend to lead more often to blood shootings. With gunshot detection systems, you get both blood shootings as well as random gunfire or recreational gunfire, or whatever you want to call it, where there's not actually anybody targeted. Now that too can make officers feel that they're running to these calls for nothing. But I think at the end of the day, again, it goes back to making sure that the community understands that you're, as a city, as a law enforcement agency, are not really willing to accept this as par for the course for a community. Obviously, also, there's a risk that when you respond to more gunfire incidents, that your officers are going to be in the line of danger more. I think that's a legitimate concern. I haven't seen any research really that confirms that this is the case. But I think that with proper training and proper policies in particularly, you're going to minimize that risk as much as possible. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. So minimizing these potential drawbacks of the systems really depend a lot on developing a good policy before you start implementing it, making sure you evaluate the outcomes of the system as well. I'll talk about that later as well. And I think, too, reaching out to your community before you implement it, seeking their input, but also explaining to them what the system does do, what the system doesn't do, and how it really is not an issue of invasion of privacy, because it really doesn't continuously monitor the community. Well, it does continuously monitor, but it doesn't record continuously. The systems typically only record sound bites of a few seconds before and after the gunfire happens, and it doesn't really pick up a lot of voices in most cases, because the sensors are typically raised above street level. So the privacy issues for these systems tend to be relatively minor, but I think that's something that as an agency implementing this is something we have to discuss with the communities. Next slide, please. So speaking about implementing gunshot detection system, what are some good ways to move about this process? Going from having an interest in the system to finding vendors to ultimately getting it up and running. I think first and foremost, of course, you want to make sure that you have a system that fits the features that are important to your goals as a law enforcement agency or city, as well as, does it meet the requirements of what we exactly want in it? So there might be different vendors that are differently suited for the specific issues you have. So, for instance, a community that has, let's say a string of neighborhoods, contiguous neighborhoods connected to each other, that have a long-standing gun problem, you might want to get a different gunshot detection system than if you have a couple of hotspots scattered throughout your municipality, and those hotspots tend to shift. Then you want a more mobile application, to be frank. It's also, I think, wise to talk to prosecutors in this process because they will be able to tell you what they can do in terms of prosecuting individuals for gun violations. So it varies a lot in the United States what you can do in terms of prosecution with, say, a reckless discharging of a firearm case. In some cases, that's a misdemeanor. In some cases, that's a more serious offense. And so having a realistic understanding of what can happen to the offenders is also, I think, important in terms of making those decisions about getting a system like this. Now, very important, and I already mentioned this a couple of times, is to develop a very good policy that outlines all the aspects of, responding to and investigating gunfire alerts that get produced by these systems. You want to think about the response priority in your community. What is the best response priority for us? What can we do? And that's not always necessarily the highest priority, but it usually is a fairly high priority level that you respond to these things. But you also want to think about who's responding to these calls, right? So are you going to send one person out to a call like this, or do you want to send multiple people to it? And I think, there's a good argument to be made that you don't want to send an officer to a call like this by themselves. And I think, generally speaking, you want to have a two-man response at a minimum. This is safer for the officers in question, but it also allows them to look at some of the incidents in a better way. I'll talk about that in a little while. You want to talk about how the site needs to be investigated. Who is responsible for doing what? Are the officers are going to, do the initial part of investigation? Are you going to immediately bring in investigators or gun crime information center folks from that? But then also, how do you handle the evidence that gets collected through this? You're going to get a lot more shell casings, and how is that going to be handled? Get dropped off at the right side for tracing and knife and hits. So those are important things to think about as well. In many cases, too, it's not just an immediate response that you're going to have to do, but also a follow-up investigation. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these gunfire incidents happen later at night, and at night it's very difficult to find shell casings, for instance. Usually during, the noonish hour is the best time because the sun hits those shell casing and the light bounces off, and makes them a little bit easier to find. So if you don't find anything at night, you have to make sure you send a follow-up team the next day to make sure that nothing was, left behind. To figure out how you're going to interact with the community residents while you're responding initially. And I think that's an important one, and I think that can't be said enough. And also figure out how you're going to track the results of the system. What is it going to do for you? What are the benefits you're looking for? I'll talk a little bit about the end on that one. Next slide, please. For implementation too, you want to think about, your coverage area. Obviously vendors would love to sell you as much as they possibly could right off the bat. And I totally understand that. It's a business thing. But as a community that wants to figure out if something is working, I think it's more ideal that you only cover part of your, community at first. This gives you a comparison group of a similarly high crime community. One gets the gunshot detection, one doesn't. And that allows you to much better track the results you're getting from that gunshot detection system. And that allows you to better assess, I think, what the value of the system is for your community. And again, engage the community at all steps when you're thinking about implementing. Start talking to community stakeholders, go to community meetings and explain what gunshot detection is, what it does do, what it doesn't do, and dispel some of the myths surrounding it as well, I think, because there's some myths circulating that I don't think quite hold up to the scrutiny that I tend to see. I think importantly, it's key to be very transparent with your community. And if you have the opportunity to show the community the data to some extent, and a lot of communities are already doing that. I know Chicago, for instance, posts its ShotSpotter alerts on its website, and so you can look at those alerts. And I think that can be done in a responsible way. In Chicago, for instance, they anonymized the latitude, longitude coordinates for the gunshot alerts so that you don't have the exact location where it happens, but you do have the time when it happens and the general incident. And so I think that gives a better understanding of how prevalent these things tend to be in our communities. Next slide, please. So finally, you want to think too about evaluation of the system before you even, implement it. And I think it's important for your community to decide what are your key outcome metrics going to be. You want to think about, is gun violence reduction the most important outcome, or is it that we want to increase the evidence that we're getting at these sites, so the shell casings, or the gun recoveries we get out of this system? Or is it an issue of we want to show arrest? Is it perhaps an even more another idea where, is it more important that you save lives with the system by reducing fatalities by a quicker response time? So I think in the general sense, you want to think about what your outcome metrics are going to be when you're going to evaluate the system, because that ultimately is going to tell you whether the system is working for you individually as an agency. Keep in mind, too, that gun violence reductions is one of the hardest things to assess with this, because, as prevalent as gun violence is, even with the recent increases in gun violence we've seen in the country, it tends to be relatively rare. And so large swings in those numbers are going to be very typical when you evaluate things from year to year, for instance. So I recommend that you don't just look at gun violence, but also at some of the other metrics I just talked about. They'll help you better assess what the pros and cons of the systems may be. Next slide, please. So talking about the specific response practices that we should be engaging in. As I mentioned earlier, I think, a high priority for these types of alerts is certainly warranted, even the highest priority if you can swing it. But that's not always possible in some communities. In some communities, and this is a particularly pressing issue recently, when a lot of police departments started losing people left and right and are down significant numbers, it may not always be possible to have the highest priority response to these calls, particularly again during the late evening and early night hours when you have a high volume of these calls. So I think if you're in a spot where it may not always be possible to have an officer immediately available to respond, you may want to think about, how do I prioritize these responses? And I think one of the things you can do, for instance, is think about looking at the number of rounds that were fired in an alert. And I would say that it's probably better to prioritize the highest number of rounds fired over other calls, simply because, when we look at some data in St. Louis, we found that more than half of the gunfire alerts, that had more than 7 rounds fired were linked to more violent incidents, whereas for lower number of rounds fired, that number was substantially lower. So it makes sense to analyze your data, figure out, where are we going to see the highest numbers of blood shootings, for instance, and make those the highest priority if you cannot respond to all at once. When your responding officers go to the scene, I think it's important for them to review the sound files. Most gunshot detection systems will send you a sound file along with the alert. And I think it's important to listen to these for these officers to listen to these sound files when they can do that safely, of course. So if there's 2 persons in a vehicle, one can listen to the sound file. And here's why it's important. When you listen to these files, you can often discern whether there's one gun involved or multiple guns involved in the shooting. And that obviously plays a big role in situational awareness for officers. And so knowing what you're walking into, I think, is an important thing for the officers. One important other thing, too, is that you, if you can, respond to the map location, not the address. So usually gunshot detection systems give you 2 indicators of the location. One, the latitude, longitude that gets mapped on a specific digital map, or a specific address. Now, in most cases, it doesn't matter much. They're very close together, but there are situations where a map location is more accurate, particularly if you're responding to a housing complex or a large park. In those cases, they have a fixed address in the parcel data because this is parcel data. And so you end up going to wherever the address is in the parcel rather than when the gun is fired. And if you're talking about a large urban park, that can be sometimes miles away from the location where it's on the map. For residential locations, that's usually not that big of a deal, but it can be the case that if you have two residences, back to back where the backyards meet, and one has a deeper backyard than the other, that the gunshot finds that the closest address is actually one street, whereas it actually is in the backyard of the adjoining yard. And so in those cases too, you might not immediately respond to the right spot. So if you have the opportunity, use the map to respond for your officers. When you respond, of course, you want to thoroughly look for evidence. And most of the time, a gunshot detection system in the vendor will tell you what the sort of probable error in the location is, because there's always a possibility that it's not exactly in the dot, but within a few feet or maybe 10 feet away from the dot. And so talk to your vendor about what boundaries you want to look in for evidence ideally. And again, schedule a follow-up visit if you don't find anything during the nighttime. There's a good chance that you do find something during the daytime. I've been out with police officers doing this a couple times, and I can tell you that in follow-up investigations, we typically find shell casings in about 60 to 70% of the follow-up visits. Make sure too that when you respond to these incidents, that all the ballistics are collected and processed in the correct manner. Make sure you keep that chain of custody. Talk to community residents and make sure that it's a priority for the officers who are responding as well. And I think finally, and this is an important one that we often overlook, is make sure your officers are trained and equipped with life-saving supplies. Stop the Bleed is a great organization that can train your officers in that, but make sure that they have the ability to render immediate assistance when they are confronted with somebody that's bleeding heavily in the street. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I often find that agencies are not doing as much is that they use the gunshot detection system to do preventative policing as well. Most of it is, most agencies use it as a strictly response tool. But I think too, the data that the systems generate can be very important to identifying micro hotspots. And if you look at this slide here, you see sort of a lot of dots in one particular spot, and that is really an indicator that you have a problem in that particular site. Now, you can then target those sites with a variety of means you can use, for instance, standard hotspot policing, or you can go the more problem-oriented policing route, where you do a little bit more proactive, modify, improve the lighting, cut down foliage that hides things from view. And so there are a couple of options I think that we can do, that we can use to prevent rather than respond only with the system. So I think they're under leveraged from what I see. Next slide, please. So for investigators, I think there's also an important role to play here and making sure that you are looking at all the data from the system. In many cases, when you have a gunshot detection system, the alerts that the department receives aren't the only data collected by the system. And most of the time, investigators can go into that system, look at the data, and see if there are any other matches that weren't necessarily forwarded to your department. It's important too, I think, for investigators to look before the incident occurred too, several weeks, several months, to see if there's ongoing gunfire in that location, which can be a good indicator that there is a retaliatory dispute going on. The beauty of these systems, though, is that you have a perfect time for when the gunshot happened. And that allows your investigators to leverage that to, look at camera footage, LPR hits in that particular time frame. And I think that is one of the things that, you really should be doing with the system if you get it, because that will help your investigators track down clues much quicker, much more efficiently. And make sure, of course, you process all the cases. And if you have a gun crime information center, work closely with them in how you, relay the information, that is the evidence that is found and the results from it. Next slide, please. There's also the point, of course, that you can integrate other technologies with your gunshot detection system. So they can be linked to cameras. So if a gunshot system detects an alert, the camera will, pan and zoom into the location. That can be good. That can provide more immediate intelligence. It can again improve the situational awareness for officers responding. And if you have a real-time crime center, it would be great to integrate that. What we do know from the research, though, is that we haven't really found any solid evidence for violence reductions when you link the cameras with the gunshot detection system. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It may just be that we haven't done enough studies yet to find it. And it doesn't certainly mean that there's not a benefit to the investigative process of hooking these two things together. But one of the things I have found in working with agencies is that they don't always necessarily track the investigative benefits of technology such as cameras, license plate readers, and gunshot detection system very well. So we don't always know exactly how good they are for solving cases. Next slide, please. So really make sure, I think, and this is something I always tell folks is, make sure you are doing evidence-based work. Make sure you assess the cost benefits of anything you implement, whether that's camera networks, LPR systems, or gunshot detection. It's important that you evaluate how well something creates a return for your community. It's important, I think, to point out that with gunshot detection system, the department will end up, paying for the system. But the benefits are more broadly shared. And so I think that if you can do that well, you have a good case to tell your community leaders, your city, that this is a system worth investing in. So things that you have to think about what go into the cost of gunshot detection systems is not just the purchase and the maintenance of the system itself, but it's also that you're going to need perhaps more officers to respond. You're going to take up more of their time. You might increase your fuel costs, which is not a trivial thing these days. More wear and tear on your vehicles. Evidence processing takes time and effort. So those are all things that stack up, and these are not negligent amounts of money. To offset that, you have to show improvements, of course, in, for instance, a gunfire reduction in your community. Now, having fewer gunshots in your community could well be a quality of life improvement for the residents. Getting there quicker means you can get people to the hospital quicker, which means you reduce fatalities. That is a benefit to your society. And obviously, if you can reduce gun violence with it, that's a very big cost saving for the community because gun violence is exceptionally expensive for the community. Next slide, please. So ultimately, to close my session off here and hand it over to Captain Gauldin, gunfire detection systems can be very useful to a community, but it's important to know that the data that gets produced by the system as well as by the community residents can generate additional layers of complexity to your data. So for instance, you may not have a single alert for a single gunfire incident, right? In many cases, when you get called by community residents, you get one call for one particular incident. For a shooting, that can be multiple alerts because a gunfire system may send you 3 alerts of connected shootings to that incident, but also you may get community calls and you may have a call from an officer who's out on the road and happen to hear the gunshots. So you may, some cases, have 6 calls for service for one gunfire incident. In those cases, when you do a data pull from calls for service data, that may not always show up and may not always show which crime might be connected to these calls for services. That may be only one call for service that the crime is connected for, and that may lead to wrong assumptions about what the gunshot detection system does for you. So it's important, I think, to train investigators really well in understanding how to access and interpret the data from the systems. So I think be mindful of how you use the data, leverage it to its fullest extent if you can, and hopefully that will be a benefit to your community. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over now to Captain Gauldin from the Winston-Salem Police Department.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you to the CNA team. we're happy to be here to share our experience with implementation of gunshot detection technology, and to piggyback off what Dennis had discussed, some of the things that we've learned and best practices and recommendations we would have based on our experience. So number one is really to focus on identifying the coverage area. And for us, in doing that, we focus on data-driven, precision-based policing, to where we looked at the calls for service for discharging firearms and where the highest number of those calls were. So that way, when we were confronted with some of the potential, concerns about where the technology is implemented in, specific communities that are dealing with the more concentrated area of the discharging firearms calls for service, then we looked at data to decide where we implemented our gunshot detection technology. And for us, we went with a 3 square mile radius. We went live on August 19th of 2021. And one of the big things for us that did was allow us to integrate ShotSpotter is the gunshot detection system that we went with, but implement that and integrate it with our real-time crime center. Next slide, please. And so just a review of some of our data that we had from the first year to kind of put things in perspective. So a lot of times we were told that 80% of the calls wouldn't get reported. And a lot of us in the department were very skeptical that was not happening here. I mean, we had a hard time believing that was happening in Winston-Salem, myself included. And so we were really eager to see if that was true or not in our community. And it actually was. So last year we had a total of 1,398 alerts. And of those, 78% of them did not have a corresponding 911 call for service, which was pretty surprising to us. We didn't realize that there was that much going on just in that concentrated area, 3 square miles, that we weren't being notified of from the citizens that lived there. And that left the 22% that did have 911 call for service with it. And Dennis also spoke about the increase in shell casings recovered and how that impacts the officer's time spent, your NIBIN program, if you have the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network as part of your gun crime reduction strategy. That's one thing we took into consideration too. We were a little fearful of how that would impact how much evidence we were entering into NIBIN, and would we have the capability to support that. What we found was, even in that 3 square mile radius, to put it in perspective, we had 3,678 total shell casings recovered just in those 3 square miles. The same time period, the previous year, citywide, we had just over 4,317 shell casings recovered, and that included both the city, the Winston-Salem Police Department, and Forsyth County Sheriff's Office. And so it really did increase our number of shell casings that we recovered. But the benefit to that was that we had that much more evidence being entered into NIBIN and being able to connect those incidents that were either using the same shell casings or firearms. So we're able to then connect the dots, even when the offenders were traveling outside that coverage area. Next slide. And so one of the things that the gunshot detection systems will give you is a monthly scorecard. And so with that, we get a monthly scorecard that they track, the vendor itself tracks independently. And then one thing that we were very committed to doing was also tracking our data independently as an agency. And one of the reasons that's important in my perspective is that at the end, so our gunshot detection system technology was supported by a grant or grant funded. And with that, at the end of that grant, we wanted to be able to compare what the vendor was telling us happened over those 3 years, but we also wanted to track it ourselves and to make sure that those two things correlated and there was not a big difference in the data between the two. And so far to this day, I mean, almost a year and a half into it now, there hasn't been much. There's been maybe 1 or 2 incidents that were maybe tracked on one side versus the other. So they're very, very, very close. But with our first year, we found 3 missed incidents, 1 mislocated event, 13 that were misclassified, and we had 7 false positives and 6 false negatives. And so a false negative is really a true shooting that occurred that the human reviewers at ShotSpotter for us had dismissed. And then the false positives is gunfire alerts that officers found evidence of some other noise. So the officers got there, discovered it was not a firearm that had been discharged, but possibly fireworks or something of that nature. So one of the things when we do council updates or command staff updates about the gunshot detection technology is to make sure that we're completely transparent about the imperfections in the system, because no technology is perfect. So no matter what vendor you use, no matter where you use it, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be little things that you find. And one of the things that we found was very, very important to do was to have the officers report that. And that's written in our policy. So when they discover whether it's a false positive, a false negative, or mislocated incident or anything of that nature, that they then email for us at support@shotspotter.com within 24 hours. That then holds a vendor accountable for kind of analyzing the system, seeing why that mistake was made. It also holds our officers accountable for truly investigating it to the fullest extent that they need to, and then making sure in the end that the system is as effective as it can be. For firearms recovered, we had a total of 47 firearms recovered during that first year. We had a total of 55 alerts involving a victim with 27 total victims. So what that means is that there was multiple alerts possibly associated with a single victim. So that's why there's more alerts than there are necessarily victims that had a victim. 2 lives saved, and that's a big thing that we publicize in City Council. We just did our annual update for City Council a couple months ago, and we actually filmed some small success story videos that I'll share with you in a minute to for the public consumption for City Council to share. And to them, that really kind of brought together the why behind the technology, why it was important for the community, and why it helped law enforcement, or how it helped law enforcement. And it really put it in a viewpoint or perspective that the general public who's not familiar with how the gunshot detection system works or why law enforcement needs it, it put it in a nice little success story that they could then understand and relate to. And then another thing we also did was to provide talking points for our elected officials. So at the annual update, a lot of times they're at meetings and get questions about the expenditures or how much certain technology costs. And so we provided them with bulleted out talking points about ShotSpotter, the contact information for the department. And so if they had any constituents that reached out to them that had additional questions after seeing the update, that they could then get clarification or additional information should they need it. All right, next slide, please. And in our implementation process, one of the big things that I found to be helpful for us was the transparency and improving our community relationships. So as I just mentioned, one of the things that officers do when they go out there, they're being seen in the community. Whereas before, with 78% of the calls for service not being reported, that was 78% of the time that there was gunshots going off in the community that they didn't see an officer respond to. So, what did they think when they heard this, but they didn't see an officer respond? Granted, we didn't have people reporting it, but still some of the people in the community would have, or, wanted to see an officer respond. So it helped us by having an officer out there, almost 80% more of the time, and then having them in the community and making contact with the residents, doing a neighborhood canvas is part of our policy. So they're required to get out. We also have CJIC door hangers, or Crime Gun Intelligence Center door hangers, that we put on people's doors when they don't answer the door, because a lot of times, they don't want to be seen talking to an officer, don't want to be seen as cooperating or providing information. So we put the door hanger on their door. There's a contact number or an email that they can contact the officer or the case officer for that alert and provide information should they choose to do so. And one of the other big things, and even in our update to City Council and in general to the community and media that we do, is to explain that ShotSpotter or any gunshot detection system technology is just one piece of the puzzle. It's not going to be the end all be all to solving, your gun crime or reducing gun crime. It's just one piece of the puzzle. And so when we implemented ShotSpotter soon after we had our real-time crime center getting off the ground, and with that, we had other technology that we're using, video surveillance systems that taps into the existing camera infrastructure in the community. So those complement each other. We're also looking at, of course, we have NIBIN. We're looking at getting LPRs on site or on board. And so various different things. And that's what we're telling City Council is why we need the money and why we need it from the community to be able to solve the crime, because putting all those together has really made it easier for us to connect the dots and solve the crime. And success depends on how a system is used. I think that goes without saying, right? We can have policies, and different things, but the policy for us was critical in our success because it really spelled out the expectations for officers about responding precisely to the location of the actual alert. And so with ShotSpotter, we get an actual, they call it the yellow dot. And so officers are dispatched to the address closest to the yellow dot, and then they're expected to get out and actually go to the yellow dot, find the shell casings or not find shell casings, and kind of document in their supplement why they did or didn't find any evidence. And as I mentioned before, the data and performance is independently tracked by WSPD. So we have crime analysts that are responsible for monitoring the calls for service and the data related to ShotSpotter So one of the things we do in our narrative, the officers write, we track specific things such as the number of, if there's a shot spotter alert and there's a firearm seized, if there's ammunition seized, shell casing seized, an arrest made, and anything of that nature that's going to allow us to then track that back to that actual shot spotter alert. And the other important thing is the ground truth, reports by WSPD to the vendor. So we encourage officers. When we initially went live, we got tons of calls like, hey, this happened, or this didn't happen, or they didn't understand the system or what was provided. And so we would then walk them through it and help them to contact ShotSpotter or whatever vendor you use, and then report that information and make sure that they had a way to get answers to their questions and figure out, if something didn't work correctly, why it didn't work correctly. Next slide, please. So implementation challenges. There were certainly some challenges we encountered. One, when we first went live with it, was the selection of the coverage area. And so, as Dennis mentioned, there was some concerns about specific communities being focused on based on the demographics of the community. However, we countered that with coming back and explaining, hey, we're not looking at anything other than the data that pinpoints that this is a location where more of the calls for service are happening. Our goal is to help people save lives, and this technology is also going to do that, but also keep our officers safe. So that was one of the big things for us, is officer safety, because they're getting that information. They're responding, obviously, to more calls for service, which was another concern that Dennis mentioned about potentially being engaged in more dangerous situations or a higher number of them. But on the flip side of that, you look at now officers are responding to those calls for service armed with more intelligence information and are able to respond more tactically sound so that they are safer. Data tracking is one of the things I would highlight from the very beginning. Make sure you have the proper data tracking methods in place from the very beginning, because it's very hard to go back and then kind of figure out what you need on the back end. And for us, as much as gunshot detection system technology costs, our goals at the end of the 3 years of our grant was to be able to then justify that. And so what I would say for that too, if you have a grant funded system, is to track it throughout and give your success stories and updates throughout the time period, and not just at the end. Because if you wait till the end if you have a 2 or 3 year grant and you wait till the end, then you lose out on some of that explanation as to the why it's important and why it costs so much, and why, your city or municipality should spend that much money on technology. Buy-in from internal and external partners was critical for us. So, the officers initially were skeptical about the technology. You're never going to make everybody happy, right, in law enforcement. But we were able to, once the technology was in place and people started responding, seeing the benefit from various levels in terms of helping them recover evidence, helping them, have more information when they respond, being safer in their response. All those things really helped the officers kind of get more comfortable with the technology. And then once they realized the information that they could get on the back end to further their investigation or generate additional investigative leads was important to their investigation and help them with successful prosecution. So that was another thing. And from the external partners is just being out there and really publicizing your success stories, the data that's either shows it is helpful or not helpful. For instance, like on our monthly scorecard for October, we just got our report back, and it was 13% down from last October. So those are one of the things we're really putting out there to our elected officials, our community members, to show and constantly keep it at the forefront of their mind what this technology is doing. Understanding the data, that's really important for us in our agency as well. And so the crime analysts do an excellent job of understanding the data and using that to support driving some of our other intelligence-led policing efforts. And I encourage you guys to consider that and how it relates to other functions, like we have a gun crime reduction unit or violent firearms investigative team, and how they use that data to focus on their investigations. And as I mentioned before, report writing is very, very important. So documenting everything and all the statistics that helps you lead it back to your data tracking. Next slide, please. And so just at the end, I want to share 2 of our success stories that we filmed. And these are examples of what I would encourage you guys, if you're considering implementing gunshot detection system technology or already have it. If you're not doing this has been helpful for us. It may not work in different communities, but it's really been helpful for us to relate it to the daily calls for service we're getting, and allowing community members to see how we're using it and the impact it has. So Chris, if you'd play that video, please.
Officer Brady Ferguson. I'm a detective with the Real Time Crime Center. And my day-to-day duties is I utilize technology to keep our citizens safe.
Generally speaking, the technology in the Real-Time Crime Center is important because it brings together various different pieces of technology. So we have the Fusus platform, which is camera surveillance or existing camera infrastructure throughout our community. And what that does is it allows us to have access to camera feeds that different businesses, apartment complexes, or anything like that in the community has and is willing to share with the police department. And then ShotSpotter is the gunshot detection system technology also. And all those things integrate and work kind of together like pieces of a puzzle.
On May 19th, officers were dispatched to a ShotSpotter alert. There were 2 shots detected on the alert. Officers responded to that alert, and while they were responding, I got onto our Fusus platform and was able to look at the cameras live, where one of the subjects in that group fired 2 rounds in the air.
We knew they were armed with firearms. And so it was very important for Detective Ferguson to share that information with officers as they're responding to keep not only the officers safe, but also the people around them, the suspects that were doing that safe, because it was an apartment building, public housing in our community, obviously occupied by several different people, and we don't want anyone to get hurt.
2 of the subjects actually went inside the apartment building. I relayed that information with a description of those subjects to the officers that were on scene. I actually pulled up the 9th floor cameras at that time, was able to see the 2 subjects that I described, and I noticed on video firing the weapon.
So in this instance, they go in there, they know they're going facing someone who's armed and who has already fired a weapon. They know they're getting on the elevator to confront those suspects.
Once the elevator opened, one of the subjects actually saw the officers and got behind, I guess, call it his partner, and grabbed his waistband. Officers challenged him at the time, was able to take him into custody. After they took him into custody, they searched his person and located a loaded firearm.
So by providing that information to them and having them be on alert and know what they're going into, we avoided having an officer-involved shooting. We avoid having to shoot someone in a public place or having the suspect potentially shoot our officers. So all in all, it was a win for everybody because no one got hurt. And that's the most important thing.
Thank you. And next slide, please. I'll talk. And this is our second success story I just want to share with the group. And this was one of the earlier ones that we had done from an officer's perspective. And again, one of the important things about these is we use these in our public presentations to talk about the technology and share the real life experiences about the life saved or how it impacted a specific call for service. Go ahead and play that, please.
ShotSpotter is a gunshot detection system that utilizes acoustic speakers and GPS to notify law enforcement when gunfire occurs. This field was behind a couple houses and some businesses. However, there was no reports from citizens, so no one called 911, and the victim didn't call 911 either. So ShotSpotter got this officer to this victim who was shot, who was bleeding in a field that no one knew where he was.
So I arrived somewhere around 11:40 in the evening, parked my car about where it's parked right now because ShotSpotter was indicating that it happened somewhere in this field. I parked here, I walked across the street. As I was walking up that embankment right over here, at the top of the hill I heard, "Help me." I saw an individual laying over here in the field. I couldn't tell at that point if he was a shooting victim or if he just needed something else. As I came over, pretty much in this pathway was where he was laying. Noticed that he was covered in blood from about his waist to his knees. I couldn't tell where his injuries were at the time, so I was trying to notify KLS, "Hey, come in off of Glenn. I'm in the field." Sergeant Thompson and I think Corporal Leach were the first 2 officers that arrived. once they did, they were able to hold him down. And I applied a tourniquet. We called EMS. EMS showed up. They did their thing and took the gentleman to the hospital.
He had no way of contacting law enforcement for help. So through this technology, that man's life was saved.
The 82-foot diameter circle that was showing, this was about the pinpoint of that area.
Here in our city, our notification, so basically 25% of the time, someone calls 911 when they hear a gunshot. So 75% of the time, that is not getting reported to law enforcement. So you could potentially have victims, right, who are victims of violence that we're not aware of until they show up at the hospital. So with this technology, we're capturing that information. We're capturing the sounds of violence, i.e. the gunshots, and we're able to respond to those areas and provide aid and investigate.
Can you sit there?
Everybody's able to see that video. And I just want to encourage anyone who has any questions about our experience and implementation to reach out to me. My email's on the initial slide at the beginning, and we'll be happy to talk about our experience with other agencies if they have any interest.
Great. Thank you, Captain. Dennis, appreciate both of your presentations on gunshot detection. I know we're a little over time. I just wanted to see if there were any questions before we get to wrap up.
I believe there were 3 questions in the chat, but Dr. Maris responded to both. I don't know if the captain has anything to add or if anyone has any other questions.
Then just a couple of wrap-up activities. We appreciate your time today. The slides and this recording will be available on the SPI website. And as Amada mentioned, we'd really appreciate if you were able to take the evaluation survey. She'll submit it in the chat. It'll also come to you as a constant contact email after the event. And it will include a link to the SPI webinar that we're putting on right now. So other than that, we really appreciate your time. Thank you to Dennis and Captain Gauldin for these presentations. I think there were a lot of practical questions and comments throughout the conversation that can really help agencies think through not only the deployment of these, but also how to respond and develop policies and that can accurately reflect how to best use these systems. So with that, thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful Tuesday afternoon. And on behalf of BJA, we appreciate your attendance.